Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Robin Stein. I'm a JDC board member and the chair of the JDC Archives Committee. We're so pleased to welcome you today to our book talk, presented as part of the JDC Archives programming in honor and in memory of my mother, Miriam Mimi Pasternak Tobin. Mom, who was affectionately known as Mimi to her family and friends, loved learning about Jewish history and was captivated by the diverse experience of Jewish life worldwide. As the daughter of an immigrant from what is now Ukraine and who lived in Cuba for a period of time before coming to the United States, she deeply valued the support provided by Jewish organizations such as the JDC. Mom believed in preserving and sharing Jewish knowledge of our Jewish heritage for future generations. She'd be so pleased that the JDC Archives continues to highlight important moments in Jewish history. For those of you who aren't familiar with the JDC Archives, the JDC Archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as the JDC or the Joint, since its creation over 100 years ago. As such, it is one of the most important repositories for the study of modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world, as well as publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and others, use our collections for their research. To support scholarly research in our collections, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. I'm also a member of the JBC Literary Society, so I'm extremely pleased to welcome and thank our co-sponsor for this book talk, the Jewish Book Council. The Jewish Book Council is a nonprofit that aims to educate, enrich, and strengthen Jewish community through Jewish literature. Each year, the Jewish Book Council reaches more than 500,000 readers with weekly reviews and essays, arranges 1,400 Jewish literary programs, publishes the literary journal, Paper Brigade, presents the National Jewish Book Awards, and provides discussion resources to over 2,000 book clubs, among other activities. You can visit their website to learn more about their programs and resources. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker today, Laura Hobson Faure, who is a professor at the Pantheon Sorbonne University, Paris 1, where she holds the chair of Modern Jewish History and is a member of the Center of Social History. Research focuses on the intersections between French and American Jewish life during the 20th century. She is the author of A Jewish Marshall Plan, The American Jewish Presence in Post-Holocaust France, which won a National Jewish Book Award. She also co-edited books on the OSE, which is the French Jewish Children's Aid Society, and Jewish communities in the 20th century, as well as the experience of orphan children in wartime conflicts. Today, Dr. Hobson Faure will talk about her recently published book, Who Will Rescue Us? The Story of Jewish Children Who Fled to France and America. Our format four will present for about 45 minutes. We will then entertain questions for about 15 minutes. Please note that your microphones are turned off and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the lecture. Dr. Hobson Faure will now begin her presentation.
Thank you so much. I'd like to start by thanking the JDC Archives, especially Isabel Rohr, for this great honor. And as I mentioned in the acknowledgments of my book, the JDC Archives have played a major role in my research from day one and have helped me understand the complex story that I hope to present to you today. I'd like to thank, in addition to Isabel, Abby, Linda Levy, Misha Mitzel, Jeffrey Eldelstein, and before them, Sherry Hyman and Shelley Helfand. The archivists at the JDC have been so important to my research, and I'd like to really express my gratitude. Now, my recent book, and I'd like to share with you a PowerPoint so you can see the cover. My recent book, Who Will Rescue Us, explores the migrations of Jewish child refugees and poses the larger question of what happens when refuge becomes a trap. More specifically, the book focuses on the efforts to evacuate Jewish and who the Nazis called non-Aryan children from Nazi territories. Beginning in 1933, but especially after 1938, parents and organizations began sending children on transports known as the Kindertransport, with the hope of removing them from the increasing violence. Today, we associate the word Kindertransport with images of children, identity tags around their necks, arriving in the United Kingdom into the arms of strangers, to cite a very beautiful documentary. The British program to evacuate children from Nazi Germany has earned its dominant place in our culture and in the historiography. The United Kingdom extended its hospitality to some 10,000 children. If the British example is exceptional due to the number of children saved and the widespread mobilization it entailed, other countries also received Kindertransport children. 4,000 children were sent to mandatory Palestine. Jewish communities in the Netherlands, Denmark, Italy, Switzerland, and Belgium also received Kindertransport children. And as my research reveals, France too became the temporary refuge for a very small group of Kindertransport children. Fewer than 500 children came to France. Who Will Rescue Us represents the first historical study of the Kindertransport to France. The significance of the French Kindertransport is not in the number of children it tried to save, but in the historical problem it presents. As I mentioned, it provides us with the opportunity to explore what happens when refuge becomes a trap. I am referring, of course, to the Nazi invasion of France that occurred in May 1940 and the subsequent occupation of France. France decided to collaborate with Nazi Germany. The Jewish refugee children who were granted legal refuge by France's Third Republic therefore became pariahs under the newly minted French state, which was collaborationist. This means that the children needed to be rescued yet again. Fortunately, a group of individuals and organizations in the United States, including the JDC, decided to take action. My book explores the evacuation of this group of mostly Jewish children from Central Europe to France in 1938 and 1939, and then the evacuation of some of these children from France to the United States in 1941 and 42. After explaining the genesis of the project, I'd like to focus on two of the book's main arguments before focusing on the role of the JDC to negotiate their evacuation to the United States. Now, as some of you may know, my doctoral research focused on the reconstruction of French Jewish life after the Holocaust, and most importantly, on the role of American Jewish organizations in that process, including the JDC. Now, this, of course, led me to the JDC archives, but it also took me to the archives of the OSE, the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, which was actually an organization created and founded in St. Petersburg in the Russian Empire in 1912. And the organization migrated and eventually came to France in 1933. It was in the OSE archive that I first heard about the children who left France in the middle of World War II to go to the United States. I began working on this project in 2011 and initially set out to understand the organizational infrastructure that had to be mobilized in order to bring the children to the United States. I also wanted to understand the experience of the children and the networks that they created as they migrated. But as I began interviewing the children and reading their writings from the period and also their later memoirs, I soon realized that none of these children were actually French children. I initially thought they were French, and that most of them had arrived in France, in fact, on the eve of the war from Central Europe. Many of them had lived together before coming to France in orphanages in Germany and Austria for Jewish children. And in other words, I stumbled upon a very important topic in Holocaust history that had never really been pieced together for France, which is, of course, Kindertransport for France. I thus reoriented my study with the goal of understanding not one, but two evacuation schemes. The first from Central Europe to France, and the second from France to the United States in the middle of World War II. While my larger research project seeks to understand the lives of these children during the Holocaust and its long aftermath, from the 1938 to the year 2000 period, my goal in this book was to focus on a very short period from 1938 to 1942. This was a moment of transition, what the historian Saul Friedlander called the transition from persecution to extermination. Who Will Rescue Us provides a transnational social history of the two evacuations, taking into account the multiple actors on each side of the Atlantic and their rapidly shifting perceptions of danger. I wanted to understand also, and very importantly, how the children felt and coped with these migrations. I placed children at the center of the study, literally, and their sources produced either during the events or later on in their lives as adults shows the diversity of the children's experiences and the complexity of them. Now, without over revealing the book, which I hope that you'll read, I'd like to explore two of its main themes. The first is about Holocaust rescue. In France, about 75,000 Jews perished in the Holocaust, either through deportation to Nazi death camps or on French soil. Nonetheless, for many reasons that we can discuss in the Q&A, a large percentage of the Jewish population in France survived World War II. When we grapple with the Holocaust in France, today we confront a philosophical dilemma. Is the glass half empty or is it half full? Should we focus on deportation and murder? Or should we focus on the real but rare acts of assistance that Jews received? This is not only a French question. There are many studies today, historical studies on Holocaust rescue, that focus on righteous individuals, and the term hero is everywhere. As important as it is to recognize Holocaust rescuers, and I think it is quite important, I argue in the book that there is a strong risk of distorting the historical record when we collect a series of fortunate events into a common narrative. Furthermore, in our current political moment, some people prefer to talk about positive stories from the Holocaust instead of focusing on the much harder questions of state and civilian complicity in deportation and genocide. Instead of framing rescue as a story of heroic individuals, I argue in my book for a problem based historical approach to rescue. To be saved, Jewish children had to be evacuated from Nazi territories. Who perceived the danger? Who rose to the challenge? And how did rescue networks work from a material and human point of view? By analyzing the rescue process as it unfolded, the book tells a complex story that defies easy generalizations and tales of heroism. Now, in the cases of both Kindertransport to France and America, it was Jewish women who first saw the danger, especially after the state-sponsored violence that took place in Nazi territories on November 9th and 10th, 1938. Now, this event is known in common language as Kristallnacht, by the German term, and to historians as the November pogrom. Jewish women such as Andre Salomon sought to make alliances, both vertical with members of the state and horizontal with fellow citizens to bring Jewish children to safety. Andre Salomon, for example, worked from her native Alsace and orchestrated the arrival of the first group of children to France, a group that was 52 in number. They came from Frankfurt. The feminist journalist Louise Weiss, whose mother was Jewish and father was Protestant, networked within French government circles, along with the Baroness Germaine de Rothschild. Together, they managed to secure visas for 240 more children. Rothschild's cousin, Yvonne de Gainsbourg, and we see her here, helped finance a network of children's homes run by the Russian Jewish organization OZE that had come to France in 1933. Now, it is important here to note a strong difference between the Kindertransport to France and the United States. I'm sorry, to the United States, but also the United Kingdom. The children who were sent to the United Kingdom and the United States were put into foster care. Those who were sent to France were cared for primarily in Jewish children's homes. Now, this allowed for a slower acculturation period. And the children were able to maintain their German language skills and were able to learn French slowly, since the homes hired German speaking educators to take care of the children. In the United States, there were also other Jewish women, such as Cecilia Ravzowski, Justine Wise Polier, and after the November 1938 pogrom, many non-Jewish women and men joined this group, including Marion Kenworthy and the Quaker minister Clarence Pickett. These individuals in the United States fought to challenge the quota system, and they introduced the Wagner-Rogers Bill to Congress. And this bill would have brought 20,000 German refugee children to the United States. Now, the bill never saw a vote. It was killed in discussion. But the group that was united around that bill managed to establish an organization called the U.S. Committee for the Care of European Children. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to leave this slide up so that you can follow the discussion on these organizations, because I know it can be kind of confusing to try to keep track of all of them. Now, the U.S. Committee was created in 1940, in July of 1940, after the fall of France. By this time, however, the group that had been concerned about children in Nazi Germany were now concerned about children all over Europe who were under the threat of Nazi bombs. And they shifted their focus to evacuating children from Great Britain to the United States. This was therefore not for specifically Jewish children, but evacuating any child from Great Britain to the United States. My book then focuses in on the case of Jewish children to ask how Jewish individuals and organizations try to convince the U.S. Committee to redirect its work in order to evacuate Jewish refugee children from France. Contrary to what we emphasize in stories of Holocaust rescue, this was not a straightforward or easy process. As I'll soon explain, it took 6 long months to convince the U.S. Committee to say yes to evacuating refugee children from France. And note the language, refugee children. There were many kinds of refugee children in France. Jewish children were part of that group, but did not make up all of that group. So as organizations were working through these very complex dynamics, the Jewish refugee children themselves were trying to process the tremendous upheaval of their lives. And this leads me to a second argument that I make in the book. We need to consider those who are rescued, who are being rescued, and in this case, children, as an active part of the story and not just as passive victims. The children produced a great deal of historical documentation as they migrated. Their sources reveal that their actions were numerous and that they were surprisingly implicated in their own rescue. Most studies on children during and after the Holocaust treat children as separate individual cases. And perhaps due to the fact that my previous training was in sociology, I sought to renew the historical literature by studying them in their groups. After the war, the children who survived the Holocaust were often assumed to be completely alone. Some certainly were, and while many felt abandoned, they sometimes were part of tightly knit friendship groups or had one parent or siblings who survived. While children's relational worlds rarely survived intact, new networks emerged during the war, at times creating surrogate families. In the book, I studied children's lives in the collective homes where they were cared for and ask how they negotiated displacement, acculturated to a new culture and a new language, dealt with separation from their nuclear families, and created these new support networks. The book shows that children coped with displacement by documenting it, often in connection with other children. They kept diaries, autograph books, and sometimes corresponded with their family members. They produced collective newspapers and documented their lives through photography and drawings. They quickly assessed what adults wanted to hear. They perceived real dangers and fought to be selected for the evacuations to the US. Their yearning to remain in contact with their families in Central Europe can be seen in their disciplined decisions to maintain their writing in their diaries, even in German, so that this language could remain alive for them, even after French had become second nature. Some children participated in complex letter forwarding schemes via Switzerland to remain in contact with their families after the outbreak of war. Ties to parents, siblings, other children, and caretakers are richly documented in these child produce sources. And like Alexandra Zapruder, who analyzed Jewish children's diaries, I consider these sources to be fragments. And I'm quoting Alexandra Zapruder when she says they're extant records stranded in a sea of missing material, evoking, but surely not representing, the vast, uncountable, incalculable loss. End of quote. They cannot be considered to be representative, but they do provide us with a rare view into children's inner worlds. Now, please allow me to give you a few examples to show how children actively process their displacement. The first example I'd like to show you is Elfrida's autograph book. Elfrida was a child from Frankfurt, and she came to France. And what we see is that once in the children's homes, sometimes the children gave each other blank books as gifts. And oftentimes, children were given a blank book as they departed from their hometowns. And so these blank books ended up becoming the perfect places to receive autographs from friends. And these autographs not only have the other children's names, but often they are a way to share information or give advice, as we see here. Other children were encouraged to draw about their lives in Germany before leaving. We see here Hilda Mann's drawing. Hilda Mann was a young girl from Primesans, Germany, and her drawing here is of the 9th and 10th of November 1938 in her uncle's guest house, in her uncle's place of business. I'm sorry. And so what we see here is the violence on the first level of the house. If you focus in on the first level, we see the windows breaking. We see violent actions of arms flaying outside the house with three human figures in front of the house. But we also can see the sense of security that the home brought for this child, with the upper levels completely intact, and of course in a beautiful color of yellow. Um, but what really changed the way I thought about children's diaries was this source, and this source is offered to me with the from the daughter of the author. The author was Heinz Lowe. He became Henry Lowe in the United States, and his diary was donated to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum with his translation attached to it. And what we see are these beautiful drawings. This was his children's home, and it says, "This is wonderful," right? This beautiful children's home where he lived in France. But when you look closely at the diary on the last page, what we see is that the images are attributed to another child named Paul Peter Porge. And what we learn from this diary is that Heinz Lowe was writing the text, but he was leaving space for his friend, Paul Peter Porch, who actually became a very famous artist later on. His friend at the time was an artist, even as a child, and his friends illustrated portions of the diary. And here we see the goodbye scene. Heinz is embracing his grandmother who took him to the station. The time on the clock is actually accurate. It's 11:20 at night. The train left at midnight, and this child is from Vienna and came to Paris in the spring of 1939. So these diaries are, of course, extremely important to the book. And for historian Alexandra Gabarini, analyzing diaries and other contemporaneous sources that were produced during the Holocaust provides a nearsighted vision of the Holocaust. And by this, what she meant is that they tell us what Jewish individuals saw and felt during the persecutions. This is part of a theoretical commitment to understanding Jews' agency during the Holocaust. they help us go beyond just the simple idea of what did Jews decide and did that cause them to live or to die? So, that very binary analysis that historians can sometimes make when they talk about Jewish victims in the Holocaust, we can go much further when we focus in on these sources and ask how these individuals perceived the danger that they were in and how they saw their future. Now, as they grew into adulthood and later in life, the children in this book wrote letters and memoirs that grapple with the past and provide insightful testimony. And these retrospective sources, qualified by Gabarini as far-sighted sources in that they view the Holocaust with distance, tell us a great deal about the meaning that individuals impart on their past. Distance from the event does not make these materials less authentic than sources from the period, but it does provide an additional layer of distance reflection that requires historical analysis in and of itself. And this is also true for oral history. I conducted about 50 oral history interviews for this book, which helped me understand how the former children, now in the winter of their lives, reflect upon and give meaning to their past. And if we were going to quote the words of a very famous historian who works on oral history, Alessandro Portelli, he said, "What makes oral history different," and that's the quote of a famous article that he wrote, "is how individuals ascribe meaning to their past and connect disparate events into a narrative." Such interviews reveal what the children were afraid to discuss at the time. A beautiful example of this was provided by Ernst Walfer, who was in his 90s when I interviewed him for the first time. He explained to me that his mother managed to get him a place on the March 1939 transport from Frankfurt because his parents were donors to the Orthodox orphanage in Frankfurt. The family rarely attended synagogue except for the high holidays. Even then, it did not belong to one particular synagogue and alternated where it went each year. The family was not indifferent to its Jewish identity. Before leaving, young Ernst had his bar mitzvah, but the family was not Orthodox. Still, Ernst received a very strange parting gift from his mother. His mother's name was Frida. And what he said is this: "She gave me a prayer shawl to wear daily, as Orthodox children wore under their clothing. And she said, 'The Orthodox have taken you out. You stay with them and you do what they do.' So all my time in Paris, I was Orthodox. My mother said, 'Look, you stay with the Orthodox group, you'll stay safe.' So I did. I learned a lot." Now, there's a great deal to say about this quote, and I'm sure we can discuss it. But its significance comes to light when you compare it to another interview that I did, this time with a woman who explained that she too lied about coming from an Orthodox family because she was afraid that if she didn't say that, she would be sent back to Germany. As a result, these teens were cared for in a children's home for Orthodox children, where they quickly learned the prayers and learned to pass. Contrary to what the adults assumed, the Orthodox children's home was not full of Orthodox children, but of children who were at times playing a role. Now, we have seen thus far that individuals, organizations, and the children themselves were actors in this story. In our remaining time, I'd like to focus on the role of the JDC and of one of the children's beloved caretakers, Ernst Papanek. And here you see him with the children, and you see the wonderful rapport that he had with them. Um, uh, Both Papanek and the JDC play a very significant role in New York trying to get the children out. And I'd like to explain, just focus in on this section of the book here because I find it extremely relevant to talk about the JDC's role in all of this. But of course, it wouldn't be fair just to talk about the JDC because Papanek is very important here as well. Now, the context is important. As we've seen, the US committee, and remember, now that we've seen Papanek, I'm going to go back to the slide on organizations to help you follow. Okay. Now, the US committee was created by a diverse group of child care experts in July 1940 to evacuate children from wartime Europe. And at this moment, just the end of the summer 1940, it was focused exclusively on England. The organization had no staff in France. And while Jewish individuals and organizations were concerned about Jewish refugee children in France and wanted to evacuate them, This was a moment of intense anti Semitism, both in France, but also in the United States. Jews, including the JDC, were unable to work alone, and they had to respect the respected channels. This meant working with the US committee to take on the task of evacuating the children. They had to convince the US committee, but the US committee had no staff in France and had the idea of asking another organization, the Quaker organization, the American Friends Service Committee, it's the last on the list here, if they would orchestrate the evacuations in France, since the American Friends had a very extensive program in the south of France. So, to ask the question about evacuating the Jewish refugee children, it required convincing two organizations, both of whom were not Jewish organizations, to step up and to help. With this in mind, we can focus and talk a little bit about the JDC. Now, as most people here know, the JDC was established in New York in 1914 to assist the Jewish victims of World War I and had since become American Jews' primary overseas philanthropic aid organization. With staff throughout Eastern Europe, a European headquarters based in Paris, and after 1940 in Lisbon, a board of directors in New York. The JDC became a powerful player in Jewish welfare on two continents, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. Even though they were not offering services, they were a powerful voice in American Jewish welfare. Thanks to its widespread aid, the JDC had access to information from unlikely corners and a clear view of European Jews' needs during the rise of Nazism. The JDC's philanthropy led to long-standing collaborations with Jewish organizations in Europe. The OZE, the first organization on the list, had been a beneficiary of the JDC since World War I. And in 1939 alone, the JDC had provided OZE with considerable funds for its work in Europe. In France, the JDC subsidized OZE's Kindertransport efforts, including the creation of the network of children's homes to house the children. After the invasion of France, the children had to be displaced to the southern zone, and the JDC yet again helped the OZE finance these tremendous costs. So the JDC was the organization to turn to when help was needed. And Ernst Papanek, so we can go back to him. Ernst Papanek, he was very aware of this, and he turned to the JDC for help. So let's talk a little bit about Papanek. Papanek was from a Jewish family, but his Jewish identity was not something at all that was important to him. The identity that was important to him was his identity as a socialist, and he was extremely active in socialist circles in his native Austria, so much so that he had to flee the country in 1934. Once France was invaded by the Nazis, he realized that he would be especially targeted by the Nazis as someone close to labor circles and of course due to his socialist activism. And this informed his decision to flee France with his wife and their two children. He had an emergency visa to the United States. Now, before leaving France in August 1940, he made a promise to the OZE children, and he repeats this promise in his memoirs, and I cite him. He said, "As soon as I'm in the United States, I will begin to work to get you over." To fulfill this promise, Papanek turned to the JDC. Even before leaving Lisbon, Papanek met with the JDC's acting head of European operations, Joseph Schwartz. On September 9th, Joseph Schwartz wrote to the JDC in New York suggesting that the JDC try to facilitate the evacuation of these children. Now, the JDC in New York was already informed by OZE, members of the OZE that were in New York already, and they were not at all surprised by Schwartz's request, and they stated that the idea had been under consideration for a long time. When he arrived in New York in September 1940, Ernst Papanek aspired to become a janitor, and this was so that he would have time to read. However, he only found work as a dishwasher. When he wasn't working, Papanek dedicated his time to advocate for the Osage children in the United States. Just days after his arrival in New York, Papanek contacted a member of the JDC, and the JDC directed him to the US committee. So Papanek entered directly into contact with one of the very important people from the US committee, a woman named Elsa Cassendick. And Elsa Cassendick was already familiar with Papanek's work in France because she had come to visit those children's homes where we see Papanek standing here. Cassendick opened up her address book to Papanek and connected him to the American network of child care experts that were working on behalf of European children and who were really centered around the US committee. Most importantly, on October the 2nd, 1940, Cassendick arranged a meeting between Papanek and the Quaker minister Clarence Pickett. Now, Pickett was the executive director of the American Friends Service Committee, and he was also a board member of the US committee. This meeting proved decisive. 2 days afterwards, Pickett wrote to France. He sent a telegram asking the head of the American Friends Service Committee in France to assess the feasibility of evacuating about 300 children under the care of Ose. Now, the JDC was active this entire period, and the archives reveal the JDC leaders were very careful when they dealt with the US committee. They had a real strategy, and their strategy involved several steps. First, they cultivated close relationships with the Jewish board members of the US committee. They really, I think, had a trusting relationship with those board members. And this included the civil rights attorney, Louis S. Weiss, the head of the National Refugee Service, William Haber, and most importantly, the philanthropist, Adele Rosenwald Levy. And it was her father, the philanthropist Rosenwald. Their family association financed a large part of these evacuations. The JDC also sought to shape the opinion of US committee leaders by linking them, as we saw with Papanek, to the people who had been in the field in France. And another person that they linked them with was the Baroness Germaine de Rothschild, who was now a refugee herself in New York. The JDC thus played a crucial role in connecting US decision makers with those from the field to make them aware of the European realities. And by late November 1940, the JDC in New York was feeling hopeful because the US committee had accepted the principle of caring and, most importantly, paying for non-English children in the United States. Remember, the goal is to shift the focus from England and on to France. So they had still not said that they would orchestrate the evacuation scheme, but the JDC was hopeful. And this is where Clarence Pickett and the American Friends Service Committee enter the picture. The help that the American Friends provided showed a solidarity towards Jews and their organizations that was quite rare in this moment in the United States. Papanek seems to have convinced Pickett to involve the American Friends Service Committee. And what we see is that from the interior, Pickett plays a very important role in getting the US committee to accept, to fund, and to orchestrate the evacuation of children from France. And they made this decision on February the 26th, 1941. So 6 months later. The JDC agreed to advance the costs of the passage on ships from Lisbon or from North Africa, Casablanca. They were both leaving from Marseille to Casablanca to the United States. And after 6 months of debate, what we see is that the selection process of children could begin. The first group of children left France for Lisbon in June of 1941. 4 other groups followed. Now, the evacuation process was not simple. And today, we know that Jewish children were in acute and growing danger. However, this was not evident at the time to all. To make matters more complicated, the head of the American Friends Service Committee in France was quite enamored with Maréchal Pétain, who was Vichy's collaborationist head of state. I don't have time to elaborate here, but let us simply state that the evacuation program was not fully supported by the entire staff of the American Friends Service Committee in France. Some of their delegates preferred that Christian children should benefit from this program and managed to include 40 Spanish non Jewish refugee children in the summer of 1942, at the moment when Vichy officials start organizing roundups, along with Nazi officials, of course, of Jews. Now, nonetheless, over 300 children were evacuated to the United States. About 280 of them were Jewish, and this saved their lives. Most of the children, the Jewish children, became the sole survivors of their entire families. Now, to conclude, I hope to have provided a framework for a deeper understanding of the complex history of Jewish child refugees during the Holocaust. Complex because the migration of even one child required dozens of letters and multiple partnerships. One had to obtain visas from hostile states, parental organization from frightened parents, appropriate housing and care solutions for groups of children. Once the war broke out, the children had to be kept safe. This meant taking them to bomb shelters, finding bomb shelters, improvising bomb shelters, and during the Nazi invasion, displacing the children in very unsettling circumstances to what became later the unoccupied zone of France, and then eventually evacuating the children not only to the United States, but after the roundups that began in the summer of 1942, to Switzerland and even to Spain. Those left behind in France after the summer of 1942 were in extreme danger, and they had to be hidden under false identities. My book suggests that many individuals and organizations found this responsibility to be daunting. And at times, those who read my book will think of the game of hot potato, where people just can't handle the responsibility and toss the children off to yet another caretaker. Yet at the same time, while the solidarity wasn't shared by everyone, there was a real form of solidarity and a commitment among some to helping Jewish children, among both Jews and non Jews. Some of those involved continue their fight on behalf of the children, even when their own lives were in danger or their own situation was far from safe or comfortable. The children, too, played an important role in their own rescue. Far from passive wards, they expressed in their sources the many ways they sought to maximize their control over their lives. But if I know their stories, it's because the children survived to tell about them. In this book, I also grapple with the challenge of writing the absent into history. We need to remember that most Jews did not survive the Holocaust, and not all of the Kindertransport children who were sent to France survived. Of the 292 children I was able to identify with certainty in a database, at least 37 were deported to Nazi death camps. This raises a fundamental problem that needs greater recognition in Holocaust scholarship. The dead cannot tell their stories. I have tried to the extent possible to acknowledge this problem by leaving a space for absent narratives in the book, like a missing photo in an album. With these observations in mind, I hope to have given you an overview of the book and to incite your curiosity. I hope that we can now dig deeper together in conversation. Thank you very much.
Laura, wow, thank you so much for writing this really incredible book. It's so enlightening. I'm sure that there's going to be lots of questions. Just a reminder that we will take the questions via the Q&A function, and then I will submit them to Laura. Okay, so now open, and I'm going to just kind of go in order here. Um, so one question asked, why do you think that the French Jews engaged in effective resistance and formed networks responsible for saving Jewish children, while in other Nazi occupied countries, such as Poland, children were primarily forced into ghettos? And then the organization, and I may be pronouncing wrong, Zegota, was formed, but that was quite late. in the history of, of the ghettoization. So
So compare France and Poland in terms of Jewish resistance, and why were some children sent to ghettos in Poland, and why was there a strong resistance network in France? That's my understanding of the question, so I hope I understood it correctly. Um, I don't think we can compare France and Poland, when we talk about the history of World War II. The two countries had extremely different experiences of occupation. Poland was fully occupied by the Nazis, and on one side, and the other side was occupied by the Soviet Union up until a certain point. Um, the entire administrative apparatus was under the control of the Nazis in Nazi-occupied Poland. The France did not experience that form of occupation. What happened is that Nazi Germany occupied the first half of France, but the French administrative apparatus remained intact. By that I mean the police, mayor's departments, and so on. There were French employees working in these institutions, and that's very important to keep in mind when we think about false papers, for example. If you have a friend working at the mayor's office, you can claim to have lost your identity card, and you can get perhaps some forms to fill out a new identity card. And many Jewish resistance groups mobilize their contacts in these administrative structures in France, and that helps save lives. So that's just a very simple example. The other fact is that the from 1940 until 1942, the unoccupied zone of France was run under Vichy, and that situation was quite different. The Vichy tried to maintain its sovereignty and to put pressure on the Nazis and refused the ghettoization of Jews in France. So it's apples and oranges. The Holocaust is much more extreme, and the survival rate is much lower in Poland when we compare it to France. For those reasons, the war is also much longer in Poland. Poland is occupied in 1939, whereas France is 1940 and is liberated in 1944 for the most part. There are some exceptions to that. So I hope that that helps give an answer to that question.
and as kind of as a bit of a follow-up, how someone had asked, how widespread was collaboration in France, as a percentage? Do you have
It's
any?
we don't have a clear percentage. It's very hard to know the answer to that question. I think it's a huge. This is where the glass half empty, half full is really important, because historians have held up that same glass and have come up with very different answers. So it's very hard to know. Um, the archives for the collaboration are also have opened recently, relatively recently, and so we can do much more research on this. And I think that what is also lacking is a great deal of people going through their attics and publishing those diaries that reveal collaboration as past, because so many people wanted to believe in the resistance myth that everyone in France was in the resistance. I think that sometimes we haven't created the space to allow for a discussion on collaboration to emerge. And that would allow us to better assess to what extent it was part of everyday life and every family. Even sometimes Jewish families had collaborators in their families. It is a possibility. It's not something that, as historians, we need to take into account the range of possibilities. And the French writer Patrick Modiano, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, his own father, he felt was linked to that. So we see that we need to do more research on these questions, and it's very hard to assess this retrospectively.
Thank you. Um, Someone had noted that the Jewish Labor Committee also supported children's homes in France. Maison Lafitte, can you characterize the difference between the JDC and the JLC's work?
Sure. Okay, this is a great question, and I want to refer you to the research on the Jewish Labor Committee by a dear colleague named Constance Paris de Bollardière, and also another dear colleague, Catherine Collomb, Collomp, and her book is translated into English. Very importantly, the Jewish Labor Committee's homes were opened after World War II to care for the orphans. They were not open at this period of time. The only group that there were several groups with children's homes at this moment, but the main group was the OZE in the early phases of World War II. It's the OZE, and the JDC is funding that. The JDC program is also much more extensive. The JDC has more funding than the JLC, which I'll explain. The Jewish Labor Committee is emanating from the Jewish labor circles and primarily Bundist labor circles. So it's a very small section of the American Jewish population. And it's not the wealthiest section because we're talking about Jewish workers and socialists who are chipping in with their paychecks to try to help Jewish Bundists and their children maintain their distinct attachment to Yiddish and their distinct culture.
Interesting. A couple of questions regarding what happened to Papanek and how did he get back to France to manage the orphanage there? After.
Okay, so to not, I hope I didn't lead to confusion. Papanek, he fled to the United States with his wife and his two children in August 1940, and he did not go back to France. However, after he did not work with those children again. The children who were evacuated, he did maintain contact with them, those who were in the United States. However, after the war, what's very interesting is that he worked for the YMCA and he went to Europe on a mission for the YMCA to talk about youth in post-war Europe. But he did not work for a Jewish organization at that moment. He was working, I believe, for the YMCA. So, so Papanek did make it back to Europe, but he spent the rest of his career in the United States.
Thank you. Um, there's a question about what was the most surprising ways that you found that the children were able to take control of their situations, and how
Mm,
does that change the way we usually think about children during the Holocaust?
mm. That's an amazing question and a tough one. How did children take control of their situations? First of all, Um, they were continually, interpreting what adults wanted to hear and telling them what they wanted to hear. The example I gave on the children saying they were Orthodox, for example, from Orthodox families, that is a prime example of how children are trying to shape their lives. They want to be safe. They don't want to be sent back to Germany, and so they are delivering what they think adults want to hear. A second example would be the fact that in the Oze archives, we see that the children are starting to really, when they organize the evacuations to the United States, the children are becoming extremely adamant that they be included on the evacuations. To the extent that the Oze decides that it's not very democratic just to select the children, and that they should create a system where the children can volunteer to go to the United States. And so they kind of try to group together all the requests to go. And what they see is a huge number of requests that there are over 3,000 children who want to go and they can't honor the requests. And those requests are coming not only from the children in their homes, but Jewish families who are trying to send their kids out as well. And so we see that the kids are harassing their counselors in order to try to get their name on those transports. So they're extremely active. How does this change the way we think about Holocaust history? I think that we have a tendency to consider children to be the ultimate victims of the Holocaust, and I think that they still are. Attributing agency to children doesn't mean that they had the power to escape the gas chambers. They don't. And children we know are extremely are targeted because they're children. They represent the future of Jewish life, and for that reason, the Nazis want them murdered. And that is a very specific issue of genocide, is that the goal is to kill children because that will end the future of the group, right? And so children are, in many respects, the a category that has been extremely victimized. But what the book, I hope, does is push back on the idea that children had no perception of this or no awareness and no ability to push back, even if it's a tiny pushback, and they don't have the power to change the final outcomes, but they do have the ability to understand and to have opinions.
How many Jews died in France in total? Okay.
The estimates have recently been reevaluated. For many years, we said 80,000 Jews were murdered during the Holocaust in France, both through deportation and on French soil. And now we know that the number of survivors is a little bit higher, um, and we have better archives now. And so what we've historians have done, historians like Laurent Joly, Alexandre Duluth, have reevaluated the numbers, and now our total number of 75,000 Jews were murdered. Others were also victims of deportations, but may have survived those deportations.
Um, are any of the wartime archives still kept in secret in France?
Um, I think that there are many archives in attics.
Mm.
I mean, so getting I mean, part of this project and part of the reason why the research was so absolutely enriching for me as a historian, but also very, very slow, was that it required going to meet individuals who went through this and asking for their permission to use their archives. Many of the archives in the book, in the back of the book, you can see the archives that I used, and there's a whole section called private papers. And all of those private papers were papers that were in the private realm that had stayed behind closed doors and had not been given to archives like the USHMM. And so there's a great deal of material. If anyone is listening, please, when you go through your parents' houses, look at the papers and give them to archives. Do not throw them out. There were painful stories of people saying, "Oh, I just threw out everything. Sorry." Right? Um, Usually not the person who lived through the experience, but the child of that person didn't realize the importance of the papers and sometimes threw it out. So it's extremely important to save papers and to reach out to archives, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or even the JDC can help guide people in making those important decisions to save the archives. So yes, there is a great deal of archival work to be done, to coax papers out of attics and out of basements and into the hands of archivists and historians so that we can write about this history.
Thank you. Good message. Um, there's a question regarding the process of the evacuation of the children from Vichy France. To what extent did the JDC and the American Committee work with the administration, and why did the government agree to any evacuations?
This book also helps us kind of weigh in on the larger debates on the role of Roosevelt in the Holocaust. It's something that I didn't have time to discuss in this presentation, but is very heavily documented in the book, is the fact that once deportations of children began, the U.S. Administration unblocked 5,000 emergency visas to evacuate Jewish children from France. And this very simple fact is something that is overlooked in the historiography. So long before the response of the the War Refugee Board, which emerged in 1944, which was considered the first American response to the Holocaust, we see these visas. They created these visas, and what happened is that it corresponded with the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, and that created a chain of events, which meant that Nazi Germany occupied all of France. And at that same moment, Vichy refused to give the children exit visas, and the children were trapped in France and were not allowed to leave. So a ship had actually left the United States for Lisbon to pick up 5,000 children. And there are children in my study who remember being sent to Marseille with the idea that they were leaving. And those children, in the end, could not leave and were trapped in France. So what we know then is the administration, the U.S. administration, of course, we can criticize inaction. We can criticize anti-Semitism within the State Department. That's been very well documented. However, the fact that these visas were made available, um, that we should give credit, right? We should give credit to the Roosevelt administration for that. And Eleanor Roosevelt also was the honorary president of the U.S. Committee for the Care of European Children. So this is not the president himself, but the first lady, right? But she was the honorary president. She was extremely active in the U.S. committee and extremely active on behalf of Jewish children. So um, I can't give you simple answers today, and I think that that's the art of
Absolutely.
of history, right? That's what we're supposed to do, is make things more complex. In terms of the JDC had a very active role from Lisbon in reserving shipping, in reserving boats. They knew which ships would be available. The second spots became available, they would block and purchase the tickets, and that enabled these evacuations to take place. I hope I answered all of the question.
Well, um, so thank you. There is also a question about, did the Portuguese consul de Sousa Mendes in Bordeaux um, help with the visas for some of the children to get out?
No, the Portuguese did help in that they allowed the children to stay on Portuguese soil for the time it took for them to leave the country. And there's actually a really interesting, they spend several days in Portugal and they have a very lovely time. So there is help from the Portuguese government in that respect. However, um, to my knowledge, there's not a connection between the Jews who are receiving visas from Mendes in Bordeaux, the Sousa Mendes in Bordeaux. Those, I believe, are Sephardic Jews who are able to claim their Sephardic ancestry and who are able to obtain those visas. So it's two different rescue initiatives that are taking place at the same period of time.
So I think you may have mentioned this, but just to kind of reiterate, so what was the percentage of children who were reunited? It was hardly any of the children were
With their
reunited.
parents, very few, very few. There were some. I can cite the example of two sisters whose mother managed to. Many women were able to. If women, let's say this, if women were able to leave Central Europe, the one option was to find a position as a domestic in England. That was a route for women to leave the country. And of course, women with children could not leave the country in that manner because they could not bring their children if they were going to become a maid somewhere. So, family strategies involved finding a kinder transport for the children and then a visa for the mom as a maid to go to England. And so one family, we see that pattern. The father left first for Belgium from Vienna. He went to set up the family there, ended up getting arrested there and sent to a French internment camp. The mother got a visa for England as a domestic, and the two girls, before the mother left, were sent to France. After 7 years of being apart, they found out that their mother had survived the war. And at that stage, the youngest daughter no longer spoke German and could no longer speak with her mom.
Mm.
But the story continues, and she, after several weeks, relearned her German, uh, and and she was 7 when she was separated from her mother. So she managed to learn her German again and become close to her mother after that absence. Very tough stories, very tough stories.
Tragic. Laura, there are so many, they're not really questions, they're more comments, just saying that this is my family story. Thank you so much. And so
Oh,
really
I'm so
appreciate
happy.
that. So,
Thank you.
so we're running out of time for questions, but just really thank you so much. This has just been fascinating, and we will have, if you look in your in the chat section of the on the one of the bars, you can find the discount code for the book. So I know we're all going to want to read this and learn so much more. So thank you so much. So I hope that each of you have found the program today as fascinating and as interesting as I had. Again, thank you so much to our partners at the Jewish Book Council for co-sponsoring this program. Our next webinar will take place on June 11th. Dan Mishman will deliver the 6th Helen Cohen Memorial Lecture. The title of his talk is The Yiddish Neshama of Yehuda Bauer's Historiography. You can register for that via the JDC Archives website and the link in the chat. We hope that you'll be able to join us for that interesting and very informative lecture as well. So you can sign up for our e-newsletter if you'd like to be added to our mailing list for these public programs and for other information. So again, thank you so much, Laura. It's been really a pleasure, and just congratulations on the publishing and the release of this book.
Thank you so much.
So
Thank
anyway,
you to everyone who attended. I really appreciate it.
thank you. Well, to everyone, stay well, and hope to see you on our next public program. Take care.
Thank you.